So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. This is the 5th webinar of the International Geraniaceae Group. And I'm absolutely delighted to be able to welcome Dr. Ori Fragman Sapir, who has been the scientific director of the Jerusalem Botanical Gardens and the scientific editor of the Flora of Israel online website, the latter since 2016. He's an expert on the Mediterranean and West Asian floras, as well as on geophytes, plant conservation, and sustainable horticulture. Ori leads professional botanical excursions in Israel, the Mediterranean, and the Caucasus, and is a licensed tour guide, as I just learned, and a professional photographer. This webinar is being recorded, so it will be made available as a video afterwards. But in the meantime, please do ask any questions you might have in the chat, and we'll try to address them later. Thanks again, Ori, and over to you.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. It's an honor to meet you, although not in person, really. And I'm delighted to tell you a little bit about the Geraniaceae in our corner of the world. I must admit we are not, we don't have a very showy Geraniaceae in our part of the world, but we have some interesting ones. And as you can see in our logo, that's the place where I work, the Jerusalem Botanical Gardens. That's a place where we do a lot of things. And I just want to make a really short propaganda about our garden. The slogan of our garden is the botanical garden, the place where plants grow people. So this is the essence of what we do. And in this context, we do a lot of talks in the internet and not in the internet. And we try to promote diversity and to protect diversity. And I will talk about conservation in my talk quite a bit, because some of the Geraniaceae species in our part of the world are really endangered. And it will be perhaps interesting for you to hear what are the threats in our part of the world, which might be very different from other parts of the world. So before we jump into the plants, I would like to make a short introduction about our region. So you can see here two maps. On the left map, you can see Israel, the Palestinian territories, and also a little bit of Egypt and Western Jordan. That's the area, and we have actually a climatic gradient. So from the top of the country in the Galilee, we have 800 or 900 millimeters of rain average, and as you go down, it drops down till the border of the Mediterranean region, which is the 400 millimeters average, and then below the 200, it's officially desert. Until the Red Sea down here with Eilat and Aqaba, and in this region, the average is 20 millimeters. So it's under 1 inch of rain a year, which is really nothing. So what happens in the extreme desert down here is that most years there is now no rain at all. And then 1 year there is a lot of rain. So it's completely unpredictable. And interestingly, over there are some really interesting Geraniaceae that exist. If we zoom out and you look at the right map, you can see the phyto-geographical regions of the area, which is the Mediterranean in green, the Sahara Arabian in light brown down, and in between we have the Irano-Turanian, which really dwindles in our region. So all these plants that comes from Central Asia. But this is more or less. You can see also Jerusalem, which is considered to be Mediterranean, but you can see that Jerusalem really sits at the edge of the Mediterranean region, what we call dry Mediterranean. So also Jerusalem is quite dry, and the eastern parts of the city is really into steppe or transition zone situation. So in between the Mediterranean and the desert, we have some transition zone area, sometimes called steppe. It is shrubland or shrublet land, which is semi-arid. And this is like a general situation. The thing is that we have a climatic junction and also a continental junction. So we have a very rich flora in a very small piece of land. So I think the last count is around 2,600 species, native species in our region, which is a lot for such a tiny country. I would like to take you on a journey between our species, and perhaps this is the first one that I knew as a kid, which is Erodium gruinum. And it's an annual, and I would like to say a few words about annuals because we sometimes forget, but in the Mediterranean and in the Israel region specifically, half of the flora is annual. So it's really a big chunk of the flora is annual. And these plants survive from year to year in seed form, and not all the seeds germinate every year, so they are kept in the seed bank in the soil, and some of them germinate and some of them don't germinate. So when we collect such seeds and try to germinate them in our nursery, suddenly we get 2% of germination, which is nothing, and we are really frustrated. But this is what happens in nature, and this is how these plants protect themselves. They don't put all their eggs in one basket and germinate all of them in 1 year, because there might be a drought or some catastrophic event at that year, and then all the seeds are gone or all the offsprings are gone. This is especially important in annual plants because annuals don't have another chance to breed. So what they did at a specific season, that's what they have. And Erodium gruinum is very famous because it has rather big flowers. And these flowers are one of them probably short-living flowers in the plant world. So they open, I would say, just before the morning. And then I think at 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock when sun comes up, the petals just fall off, and that's that. So you might see a carpet of these flowers, but each flower will live for a few hours. It's very difficult to tell the different species of Erodium. I think Erodium is the largest genus in Geraniaceae in our region. Some of them are really difficult to tell one from the other. But this species has a very, I would say, ridiculous character, and that the character is that it has purplish veins on the leaves. Now, these kind of characters are not mentioned in the floras or in literature. So what we are trying to do is collect this data, and especially field characters, which sometimes are very good and very important, and record them in one of our websites, Flora of Israel Online, which I will introduce a bit later. Here you can see the two cotyledons, the first leaves of the seeds, and then immediately the adult leaves have these purplish veins. So when I see the flowers, I immediately go down to see the veins, and then if they are purplish, then I know it's Erodium gruinum. And Erodium gruinum is a common Mediterranean species. Now, as you go to the coastline, you find this kind of plants that look very, very similar. If you see here, I would call this habitat a fallow field. So it's kind of a disturbed habitat that was left abandoned. And over there, a lot of annuals and herbaceous plants and flowers dominate. It is a very rich, disturbed habitat. You can see vaguely a lupine here in the middle, which is Lupinus palestinus. But you can see also the Erodium dotting the whole area. It is very similar to gruinum, but if you look at the gruinum and then again here at this species, which is telavivense, you can see it's much more hairy. And there are also characters in the fruit and seed. That comes later. Erodium telavivense is obviously named after the city of Tel Aviv, and we always have the feeling that Tel Aviv is a very young city, but Tel Aviv is, I think, 120 years old already. So this species was probably described in the 30s or 40s, something like that, and was named after Tel Aviv, which is a new Hebrew name for a new. Tel Aviv is the first, Jewish city in Israel. It's the central cultural center of the country. This is where I live, by the way. and we are very proud to have a species that is named after the city. Now, what is also very interesting about this Erodium is that it is endemic to the coastal region of Israel. So it doesn't grow anywhere else in the world. It is it's a very narrow endemic species. By the way, the same as this Lupinus palestinus and some other species. Now, if we show this to international conservation people, one would say, oh, this is very important to protect, this is going to disappear very quickly. But we know that although it's very narrow, it has very big populations, it grows in disturbed and undisturbed habitats. So locally, it's not really under threat, although it is dwindling. So we should watch it and see what's going on. And if it goes down, then we might have to protect it in some other ways. But superficially, you'll see these flowers as I did until, I would say, 10 years ago. I would say this is gruinum, just like the one you see here, just the same. But as you go into details, you see the hairiness. There are no purple veins on the leaves, and the fruit is a bit different, and that's another species. The other one that has big flowers and is very similar is Erodium ciconium. And it is a Mediterranean plant, but in our region, it is confined to the transition zone and to the semi-desert. Together with this sage, beautiful sage, annual sage, which is Salvia viridis, if you know from gardens perhaps. But again, superficially, it looks just like the same of the other two species. Rather big flowers. If you look at my hand, such a big flower, and the fruit is very long and impressive. But if you look at this plant, you see that the leaves are really dissected. So they are not entire, they are compound, almost pinnate, I would say. And this is very typical to plants that are approaching the desert. So that's probably the vicarious or the close species that replaces gruinum into the desert or into the semi-desert. And over there, it's again quite common. We don't have much experience in cultivating these beautiful wildflowers, and the reason is because they are very common, so you can see them in your yard anyway. But I think we should introduce them. We are already in our garden, we're already growing 40 wildflowers that we promote and we distribute. And we have never thought about Geraniaceae. Perhaps the reason is that they produce quite a little amount of seed per plant. It's not like a poppy that every fruit have like 200 seeds. Here, every fruit produce only 5 seeds. So that's the thing. Another thing I would like you to notice is the number of anthers in the flowers of Erodium, which is only 5. So there are 10 filaments, but only 5 of them are bearing the anthers, and we'll compare that with other species as we go on. There are moments in my life that I always remember. So this is a moment which I remember when I was just, sitting. It was raining, drizzly, and I was a bit wet and a bit miserable. And then I look at these flowers, and the sun comes up a little bit, and you see the color through the flower. And I managed to capture this with my camera. So these are, for me as a botanist, is a magic moment, is a magic, beautiful moment, I would say. And wherever, when people ask me, oh, why did you choose to be a botanist? It's not the best business, And I always say, because it's beautiful. That's the reason. It's really nice. And here you see the Slimonium, ciconium. This was taken in the Jordan Valley, so next to the Palestinian region. And it was magic together with red ranunculus, but turban buttercups. That's the progenitor of ranunculus that you see in the flower shops. So after looking at 3 big flowered annual Erodiums, let's go to another kind of Erodium, which is Erodium acaule. And this guy is perennial. And the flowers are rather big. They're smaller than the other flowers. So I would say about this size, or a centimeter and a half across. And what is very interesting about this flower is that it blooms almost throughout the year. It is a mountainous flower, so you can find it in Galilee, in the Golan Heights, in Mount Hermon. And then you come in August, it's completely dry, and suddenly you see these flowers on the roadside. It likes disturbed habitats. So I've never seen it in a natural or primary habitat. It's always in kind of disturbance, where in passes where cows are passing or along the roadside, things like that. And whenever I see it, it always surprises me, because in the season, especially in the summer or in the early autumn, let's say September, October, for us it's early autumn, you don't find many flowers, and suddenly this thing pops up. So that's definitely a plant that we should cultivate and should see how it behaves under cultivation, because these beautiful flowers in nature might be very beautiful and create even, ornamental displays in nature, but when you cultivate them, the plants are not behaving as they should. So there is one flower here and one flower there after 2 months, and then you invest a lot of time and a lot of money if you're a botanical garden or a private gardener, and you don't get the reward, the flowering reward you expect. But in this case, I would say that might be interesting, because it's a perennial. I would say this might fit a rockery situation, and it might be a good one. We've never tried it. Again, look at the 5 anthers, which are more clearly seen in this picture. Going back to the coastal region, we have another very interesting Erodium subintegrifolium, which is also, like telavivense, endemic to the coastal region of the country. Now, they grow in a red sandy loam. So they grow in a very special soil. And what is even more interesting is not only this species is endemic, the soil is endemic. So this soil doesn't exist anywhere else in the world, but in the coast of Israel. This red sandy loam was created from sand dunes that were laid on the coast, but in wet geological times, when there were forests, they were transformed into kind of a small grained soil, sandy soil, which is this reddish soil. In our language is called hamra. And this soil, because it's endemic, quite a few species evolved on these soils, and they are also endemic. And this guy over here is already really an endangered species. So here you can see it in nature on the right side. It has a rather big flower for such a small plant. The flower is about this size, and the whole plant is maybe 10 or 15 centimeters tall. And you can see that the leaves are entire or almost entire. And what is interesting about annuals in general is that if there is little rain, it will germinate, it will produce one stem, couple of flowers, and then it's done what it can do. But if there'll be additional rains, it will split very quickly and become much more robust, and might have maybe 50 flowers, 20 flowers, much more flowers than compared with plants in drier situations. We've collected the seeds, and to our great joy and surprise, we have very good germination. So here you can see one seedling that germinated from the seed, and we track all these seedlings because we want to have also a seed guide to identify the plant in seed form in nature, which is another project. I must say that this might be, and I see a few smiles in the audience, this might be the peak, the ornamental peak of my talk, which is the tuberous Geraniaceae, or the tuberous erodiums of our region. And Erodium crassifolium is one of them. And it's a marvelous plant. It has a much dissected leaves, I would say ovate leaves in general, and it has very big flowers, and you see the 5 orange anthers in contrast to the dark patch at the base. So this is primarily a pollen flower. So it doesn't produce nectar. It produces pollen as for fertilization, but mainly or also for as a reward for the pollinating bees or insects. So if your reward is orange, you might want to have a contrast for the reward, which is created down here. There is a very good another example for that you might know from the flower shop, which is the red anemones, which have a white patch in the middle that is contrast to the black anthers. So this is a very good, and you can see that in some plants the patch is very big, and in other plants the patch is more limited. Again, this plant, which is tuberous, grows much bigger in a rainy season and will be completely dormant in dry season. So it might wait for 3, 4, 5 years without any rain and will do nothing. And then there will be 1 year with more than, I would say, 2 inches of rain, and then it will wake up, and very quickly, it doesn't have to germinate like annuals. It has the tubers with something inside. So very quickly it can revive, it can sprout and blooms very early in the season, much before all the annuals will grow and bloom. You can see here the seed that is stuck on the ground with this feathery beak, which is very typical for this species. And one thing that is very nice at the end of the season, where this plant is common, you go to a field and you can see a field full of these feathers that are stuck in the ground or just rolling in the field, which is another nice experience. Here you can see a few more of them in different, you can see it grows in rocky desert, not in sandy desert so much, but it grows also on the soil in quite a big different kinds of habitat. It is disappearing in the extreme desert, but it grows in areas that get some rain. These are the tubers that were dug by a Bedouin friend for me in Jordan. Just he wanted to show me that they are roasting the tubers and they are eating them, which I didn't know. And of course, you can plant these tubers. He was working quite hard to dig them out. So the plant was a small plant, and then he was digging, I would say, 20, 30 centimeters, which is a lot, until he found a few of them. These are root tubers that are, at the end of the roots mainly, and he found a few of them. He probably didn't pick them all. The few of them were kept in the ground, and this is Bedouin food, survival food in the desert, which is exciting. Now, if you look at this flower, it might look very, very similar to this one. So the flower is really the same. But if you look at the leaves of this one, you can see these are almost succulent leaves, and they are not that dissected. And this is Erodium arborescens. And if I was saying that the crassifolium doesn't grow in the really extreme desert, that's because this species is not that adapted to the very extreme desert. It is replaced by its relative, which is this guy, Erodium arborescens. It is called arborescens because big plants that survive a few years have this woody or kind of woody base that looks like a small tree that is kept dry in summer. And again, after the rain comes, they sprout quickly and they bloom quickly. And this grows in the really arid mountains of the southern Negev desert towards Eilat and the Red Sea. In winter, just after the rain, it might look like this. You see that this waxy and almost succulent, subsucculent foliage. And when it is in full bloom, it's a real joy. You can see how dry it is around it. Again, unlike other plants, it has its storage. It's also tuberous. So it has its water storage and also nutrient storage. So with a little bit of rain, it wakes up and then it blooms out of the blue in a place that looks superficially dry, but obviously it's not dry because there is some humidity, rain humidity in the soil. And this plant, I think, would be very good under cultivation. I know this plant is cultivated in two places actually in desert villages, and it's doing quite well. So in a garden that is not irrigated in summer, this plant will wake up and will bloom every year if you give it some irrigation in the cold season, let's say starting October. But if you will irrigate it in summer, it will just rot very quickly and you'll just lose it. So that's our very limited experience with this plant. You see how there are many Erodium species. Here you can see a herbarium sheet from my childhood herbarium that was donated later to the National Herbarium in Israel because it got too big for my apartment. And what is interesting, I put the herbarium sheets just to show you that this plant has two types of leaves. The lower leaves are really almost entire and the upper leaves are really cut. So this is Erodium botrys that grows in non-limey soils in the coast, and then again it pops up in the volcanic soils of the Golan Heights. But if we go back to the desert, there are some species that you might miss because when you look at them, they look something like this, which is a dry chunk of stems and leaves, not really attractive. But when you zoom into these stems, you can see delightful little flowers. It's not really a showy plant. In the early winter, it will produce also succulent foliage. It's also a perennial. So the annual erodiums really disappear in the extreme desert because the dry gaps might be too long for them, and then the viability of the seeds will be gone. If 5 or 7 years there won't be rain. So only perennial species survive also in the extreme desert, and you can see the adaptation, this succulent habit of these perennials, which are not really showy but interesting in their behavior. All this data we are trying to record in our website, in one of our websites, Flora of Israel online. So if you Google Flora of Israel, you'll get our website. And here you can see the same Erodium glaucophyllum. You can see beautiful macro photography of the anthers and the stigma. So we get really top photographs from some top photographers and amateurs in the country. And you can see also rulers which we've just placed. The foliage ruler, so you can see this plant is waking up in November, December. It's green until April, May. And you can see the blooming season, but you can see also the fruiting season. So when the fruit is green, when the fruit is ripened, and when the seeds are dispersed. So there's a lot of information in these rulers. If you go down the same page, you can see also additional ecological and other information, and also a distribution map of that species. And you can see the species grows in the southern, but also grows along the Dead Sea, even the northern Dead Sea and Judean desert, and also on the other side of the border in Jordan. So if you are interested in Erodium, in Geraniaceae of our region, or any wild plant in our region, whether it's native or invasive or alien, you can look for it in our Flora of Israel website. We have the obvious weedy Erodiums, which you might know from other Mediterranean countries, obviously, but maybe cicutarium all over Europe and some other places. Cicutarium has this deeply dissected foliage, and what is interesting again is as you go to the desert, this is still cicutarium in the Mediterranean region. This is a very healthy plant that got a lot of rain, so it produced a lot of stems and will bloom until May, I would say, which is very late. But as you go to the desert, you get this one, which is non-symmetric flowers, and the foliage looks very similar. You see, the foliage looks very similar, but the plant, but the flower is asymmetric. So this is the desert cousin of cicutarium, touchyanum, Erodium touchyanum. I've skipped another couple of Mediterranean desert species. And these one usually have these small flowers, but they are magenta pink color. So malacoides with entire leaves in the Mediterranean, and neuradifolium with the dissected leaves in the desert. So it's very typical for plants in the desert to have smaller leaves, more cut leaves, so they lose less water. This is very common. Here you can see a carpet of malacoides. What is nice about all these erodiums is that they might be very common in wastelands, in roadsides, so they like this disturbed situation, many of them. That's another desert one called the oxyrhinchum that has these palish flowers, but also glaucous bluish foliage. And here you can see it, and this grows deep into the extreme desert. I think the last one is Laciniatum, which is very curious kind of plant because it grows in the desert, but also in the coast, and it has different forms or different varieties. So here you can see a small flowered variety in South Jordan, but here you can see a very big flowered variety, which is endemic to the coastal sands, as I was saying about other species in the beginning. So I think more research is needed in this complex of Laciniatum, and we might split it into species or subspecies. I always identify them with the flower shape. So the flower is not like an open plate, but it's kind of deep. It looks like a bit like a funnel, or I don't know, a bell, which is unlike others. So we've done with erodiums, and we are going into geraniums, which are also very weedy and very common, like here Geranium robertianum, which grows in the Mediterranean, I would say semi-shade habitats, so the edge of Mediterranean scrub or shrubbery or roadsides or agriculture areas. You can find this plant, it's very common. Or Geranium molle, which is a tiny annual that grows almost anywhere in the country, and there are a couple more species that are there, but they are not really interesting. What is interesting is this guy over here, Geranium libani. You can see also the Hebrew name. I'm sure you all can read it. And the Hebrew name comes from a similar talk I gave in Hebrew, so I kept the Hebrew name in some cases. So Geranium libani is a perennial, and I think it is related to the perennial large flowers geraniums of Europe or Eurasia. And this is the last one that grows in our region. It grows only in the Upper Galilee, in Mount Meron, above 1,000 meters. So the hottest place in the world for this species is one of the coldest and rainiest place for us in Israel. And we've cultivated this one, and it's really easy to cultivate. It also can manage with an irrigated bed that where you might want to grow other stuff. In summer, it will bloom in April, May, and then it will become dormant in summertime. And then again, like a surprise, it will pop up in November, December, and will do what it does at the next spring. Geranium libani. What is very confusing is this plant. This plant was named Libanoticum, not Libani, but Libanoticum. And if you look at the vague foliage over here, you can see it has very different foliage. And in my opinion, this Libanoticum is just a robust form of a very widespread species called tuberosum. Tuberosum usually has these narrower petals, and here you can see there are more broad petals. But you can see all the intermediates between these two forms, and the tuberosum obviously is tuberous, and is very common all over the country, especially in semi-arid situations. I'm sure you've already counted the anthers here, and you can see that that here there are 10 and not 5 anthers. That's general for the genus Geranium. Some of these geraniums are rather rare. For example, columbinum. European botanists probably burst into laughter because this is one of the most common European weeds, I would say. But for us, it reaches the edge in our region. So one thing is very interesting in our region is that the whole flora is peripheral. It's either Mediterranean or Euro-Asian elements that disappear in the desert, or vice versa. So everything ends in our country. That's another small geranium, lucidum, which is the annual. This is very interesting. Matcatense is a tropical plant that was found only once as a weed in a planted forest. It was found only once, but a crazy botanist collected the seeds, and since then we grow it in our garden. So these pictures were taken in our garden. It's a peculiarity. I would say it's a casual plant that got there by mistake. We don't have a sustained population of this plant in Israel, but it's a beautiful one. And what is very interesting is that if you don't irrigate it much, it will have not these flowers, but it will have tiny flowers that will not open. They will self-pollinate, and the cleistogamous flowers that will produce seeds that are as good as flowers with petals, as you can see in this picture. So this kind of peculiarities also happen in our region. I've done with the two big genera in the family in our region, and I would like to come back into the extreme desert. And if you go to Elat Mountains, which are granite mountains, so it's granite soil, granite rocks, which is very unique in our region, you find only in rainy years this plant, which is very, very hairy. And for years, you can see the beaks here. So for years, we said, it's an erodium, but we never really seen the flowers or the fruits. We just saw these hairy stems and few leaves. And we didn't know, to be honest, we didn't know at first what the hell was that. Until we saw the flowers properly. And you can see here the flowers, and I'm sure you've already counted the anthers, and there are 15 anthers here. And this is Monsonia with 15 anthers. And this flower is very, very interesting, extremely rare and endangered. It's perennial. I would say it's probably a short-living perennial. So this plant probably lives for 2 or 3 years and then it dies. If there is rain, and in Elat Mountains, it's the less than 1 inch of rain every year. So usually there is no rain. So for example, last year there was not a single plant visible, but they are there. But if there are some rains in a few years, then they will sprout and then they will even bloom, and that's a joy for botanists and people who are interested in these strange flowers. Monsonia is a genus from the south. So it's an African Indian genus, I think. And there are fabulous species in South Africa with very big flowers you might have seen, but this is a very shy one. It grows in one of our desert gardens in the village of Samar, and over there they irrigate and then it blooms all over the year. It doesn't stop blooming. It's like a tropic. It doesn't feel the season. If it gets water, it just does what it does. So it is evergreen, I would say. Here you can get more of that. Again, the flowers lives for a few hours, and towards noontime they disappear. The last one in this, the last and second one in this genus is Monsonia nivea, that has a very different kind of hairiness. You can see it doesn't have these long spreading hairs like Heliotropoides, but it has this silky hair, Monsonia nivea. And on the right side, you can see a very mature plant. It is perennial, so I would say this plant must be 7-8 years old. Usually the plants of Monsonia nivea are much smaller. So what has happened, you can see it grows in sandy soil, unlike the other Monsonia. And what is happening is that it germinates in a rainy season. And then if it's a rather dry year, it will produce a few flowers, a few seeds, and it will die. It will behave like an annual. But if it's a rainy season, and then it can overcome the long summer or the long dry period until the next year or the next few years, it will survive the drought period, and then it will resprout and become much, much bigger. So again, I would say a short-living perennial. This is exactly the point, a very interesting evolutionary point, where a plant have to decide whether I'm annual or I'm perennial. It's kind of it has to behave. It has to decide. I'm surviving or I'm giving up. I'll do all the seeds I can, and that's it. So plants do behave, and sometimes that's really exciting. Here you can see again the flowers with the 15 anthers, typical for the genus Monsonia. And the last plant I would like to show you is not a true. It's not a true Geraniaceae, although it used to be. And when we saw it for the first years, we had no clue again what the hell is this plant. It's acaule. It's we didn't know even the family. And when we squashed the leaves and we smelled them, we couldn't say what it was. And you see here there is a stem, but it was cut because it was consumed by goats. So in some populations, especially in South Jordan, it's an overgrazed area, and these plants very rarely bloom because they are eaten, especially in average or dry years. All the plants are being consumed by the goats and overgrazing. In a rainy season, in a very good season that happens once every 10 years or 15 years, suddenly you can see some plants in bloom. And here you can see the flowers. Now again, these flowers, I was very excited to see this plant, Biebersteinia multifida. I thought, okay, these flowers are going to open. I will wait, I will come back and they will open. But they didn't. That's what they do. So the flowers are really small. The plant is really attractive. It is especially the calyx is covered by dark glands, which are very interesting and very typical for plants in grazed areas. So this plant will grow in high mountains, high arid mountains. Now in high arid mountains, it's very cold in winter and even snowy. And so they cannot wake up in winter. So they wake up, let's say in April when the snow melts, but then the soil is wet for a couple of weeks. That's it. And then the long rainless summer begins. So they have a very short period of time to do whatever they do. So what they do is they keep everything in this tuber. So we've dug one of them in a big population. In Israel, it is endangered. So we've dug only one of them. And unfortunately, I lost this tuber because it was rotten in our garden. It was irrigated in summer and the soil was not drained enough. So now we have new plants that we grow from seeds and they are doing much better. So this plant will sprout in nature, will sprout in April, will grow in May, will bloom and fruit in June, and then it will dry and finish whatever it did. Very short time and very strange situation. So we did a quick trip along the country. I hope you can visit in better times. Maybe after Corona times, you can join us in our field trips. We do quite a bit of those, and you are welcome, of course, in our botanical garden when you have the chance to get to our region. I would like to thank you and hope you enjoy. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ori. I'm sure everybody enjoyed your talk and the absolutely fantastic photographs as well. Thank you so much.